Hello, good evening, and welcome to Scotland at 7 here at Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart, and I am here in our studio in Cookaddens in the south side of Glasgow. But I am delighted that this evening I am going to be joined by the Chief Executive of the Scottish Independence Foundation, Greg McCarra, a great friend to the programme and indeed the station. So, Greg, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here, Donald. Always enjoy it. Thank you.
And we begin this evening, as we always do, with our Ukrainian update on day 454 of the illegal Russian attack on the sovereign state of Ukraine. Moscow claims to have pushed back the fighters it says launched a cross-border attack from Ukraine into the Belgorod region. There has been little clarity about who ordered the attack. Russia has claimed it was carried out by Ukrainian militants, dismissing reports they had self-identified as an ethnic Russian anti-Kremlin militia. Belgorod Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov had earlier warned residents against returning to their homes. Video footage posted online by one of the groups of Russian partisans appeared to show US manufactured military vehicles were involved in the raid, including Humvees, and what happened to be international Max Pro 1224 mine-resistant vehicles. A US State Department official reiterated the US policy that it did not support military action by Ukraine beyond Ukraine's borders. Ukrainian forces still control the southwestern edge of the city of Bakhmut, and fighting in the city itself has decreased, Deputy Ukrainian Defence Minister Hanna Malaya has said today. Ukrainian Deputy Renovation Minister Yuri Vaskov has said that the Ukrainian port of Pevdenyi has halted operations because Russia is not allowing ships to enter, cutting it out of a deal allowing safe Black Sea grain exports. Belarus has taken part in the illegal deportation of children from Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine, according to a preliminary report compiled by exiled Belarusian opposition leaders. Volodymyr Zelensky visited Marines on the Volodar-Marinka defence line in the Donetsk region today as part of celebrations for the National Day of Ukrainian Marines. Ukraine said that on Monday, Russia carried out 20 missile strikes against Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhzhia and Kharkiv oblasts using cruise missiles, Iskander-M ballistic missiles and S-300 anti-aircraft missiles over the past day, and that Russia launched 48 airstrikes using Shahed drones. Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin has arrived in China for a visit, where he will meet with President Xi Jinping and ink a series of deals on infrastructure and trade. The training of Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16 jets has begun in Poland, the EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell has said after the US gave its green light. Germany is considering options to support a coalition of countries planning to train Ukrainian pilots in flying F-16 fighter jets. The Northern Group of 12 Northern European countries met in Poland on Monday to discuss stepping up deterrence and security on NATO's eastern flank and strengthening Ukraine's defences. The US State Department has said that the Russian mercenary Wagner Group is trying to obscure their efforts to acquire military equipment for use in Ukraine. Greg, I'm quite sure that every time I come into the studio they find another Russian or Ukrainian name to fling into the mix, and it's quite bizarre that I faltered on the word ink rather than some of the longer words that are in there. But over the last few days or so, we've seen Zelensky taking himself round beyond Europe's borders, going to G7 summit and trying to recruit some kind of wider international support for what's happening in there. I would imagine that as time progresses, the hope that there's going to be some kind of negotiated settlement, is it going to diminish? Is it going to increase with international pressure? Who knows?
I I'm not so sure about the negotiated settlement. I think the negotiated settlement is the return to the full integrity of the Ukrainian original borders, including Crimea and certainly the eastern oblasts. Because anything other than that is saying launch a war, occupy territory, and you don't have to give it all back. And then start again, occupy another country, take some of its territory, and let that go on for a few decades, and you've lost half of Europe. As has happened twice in the last century. I think the resolution of it is the removal of Putin, hopefully by the Russian people themselves democratically or whatever method is available to them. Meanwhile, I think the support for Ukraine is quite correct and must continue.
Indeed, and I suppose that those of us who are old enough to remember the Iraq War and the idea of regime change, that it may require just exactly that very thing in Russia, that there needs to be some kind of alternate to Putin put in place, if you pardon the repetition, that allows us to see a more democratic and stable government within the European parameter.
It's the standard in totalitarian states that support for the dictator is total, right up to the moment when he's deposed or she is deposed. And similarly in there, we've seen other Russian leaders toppled, and it's possible to demonstrate maybe there's popular support for him, but that's quite easily done. You starve people of the truth. Pravda doesn't really have any standing in that little context anymore, and I can understand people falling for what the media tell them if they only have a very limited source of information. But as you said, you mentioned other countries in the Middle East, Iran in particular, where the day of the Ayatollahs has come, but long since, but it may go as well because the people might just have enough. By the way, it applies to Western democratic countries as well, when people don't really have the news that they should have and the information from a variety of sources rather than being fed from central sources. And people get deluded into supporting their own government fully, much more than they possibly should.
Indeed, and going from international news, we have our usual wide range of news items this evening that covers those things that have been subdued, including financial, economic and European exits. We'll be talking about Scotland's global status and business, particularly focused in Spain, but also things that we wish were subdued, including food inflation, the Home Secretary and a certain former American president. But we start tonight in a report that has come out and perhaps is a slightly different slant on it than the way that we're going to look at it, which is where the IMF has said that the UK growth outlook remains subdued. The International Monetary Fund has upgraded its forecast for UK growth, saying the country will no longer fall into recession this year, but warned the government not to cut taxes, as that would fuel inflation and result in higher interest rates for longer. In a message to the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, more of him later, they told him that he should maintain his planned squeeze in public spending, as the Washington-based body said tax policy should stay aligned with monetary policy in the fight against inflation. The IMF said that the outlook for growth, while improving somewhat in recent months, remains subdued and forecasts growth to slow to 0.4% in 2023. Growth is projected to rise gradually to 1% in 2024 as disinflation softens the hit to real incomes, and to average around 2% in 2025 and in 2026, mainly, according to the IMF, on the back of a projected easing in monetary and financial conditions. Thereafter, growth is projected to settle at 1.5%. On investment, the IMF said that the green transition should be expedited to meet net zero objectives and enhance energy security, adding that there is scope for additional quantifiable measures to fully meet the net zero targets. The IMF also called for more incentives for the green transition, for example, by expanding the grant programme for low-income households' heat pump installations and home insulation, and remove existing bottlenecks, including by setting out longer-term plans to attract private investment. The transition to a greener energy mix would also open up further opportunities to lower energy input costs and increase energy security. Greg, we sort of highlighted a bit about the media earlier on, and I think that's one of the issues here, that a lot of the mainstream media today have been talking about, we're not going to fall into recession. Ain't this wonderful news? But when you look at the meat and the detail that's in here, actually, particularly about the green transition, that seems to be something they are very keen to see us meet our net zero, but also invest in. That it seems to be a bit of a mixed bag, that the media are only hanging their hat in one, but there actually is a bigger coat that should blanket our entire economy.
Just lost you for a second there, Donald.
Greg, I can still hear you.
I'm back. Lost you for a second. I think I'm okay. I got the gist of it. Will I jump in?
Go for it.
Okay. The whole load of things in there. That was a very big item. Green transition, and a just transition, as we talk about it in the trade union movement, is absolutely essential. So I'm not going to fault people who talk seriously, honestly about that. Some do so less honestly. The green transition is sometimes just greenwashing. So, for example, we have in the UK government that to help our march to carbon neutrality, they're going to say that define nuclear energy as being carbon neutral. No. No, it's very far from it. And it's an easy one to demolish. I'm not going to get into the debate on it, but all I'm saying is greenwashing, instead of telling the whole truth about it. The IMF, we could easily diverge into a whole load of things in there. I'm not a massive fan of the IMF. Look at recent events over the weekend, where unfortunately Syria, the previous, from a few years ago, the government in Greece only got 20% of the vote. New Democracy, the right-wing governing party of the moment, got double that. They're back in. But you know what? Greece was brought to its knees by the IMF imposing reductions in standard of living, which were unnecessary, which were going far too far, and just imposing austerity into a country that didn't actually need it. The bit about economic growth, I'm not too fussed if it's going to be 1%, 1.5%, 2% or whatever. What I can predict with high confidence at the economic growth of the bulk of the cabinet secretaries in the current UK government, their economic growth will be quite considerable, as it has been all the time they've been in government and for as long as they continue. The economic growth of ordinary people around the country is a slump, because they're getting real-term wage cuts, and they're seeing a vast increase in prices. It's a double hit. Less money, more expenditure, and they're struggling. So the IMF is not my favourite arbiter on what is good for people. So maybe I'll finish my point in there saying that I think, as I've said on this programme before now, reliance on economic growth, GDP per capita, whatever, these are rather obsolete terms, and we really should be looking at a well-being economy which measures rather more than just numbers of that sort, which don't relate to the overwhelming majority of ordinary people and are the favourite topic of the ultra-rich.
Didn't hold on to that thought, because the next item in terms of well-being is about low public confidence in United Kingdom economy, as new research is showing people in the UK are among the least confident of any country on the prospects of an end to the cost of living crisis. A survey of 29 countries by Ipsos Mori this month has revealed 6 in 10 people in the UK thought it would take at least a year for inflation to return to normal levels, which is the most gloomy outlook of any country bar one, Sweden. The survey also revealed that UK households are the most gloomy of all countries about their own disposable income levels, with 46% believing their income after tax and bills will fall over the coming year. And Ipsos Mori researcher Mike Clements warning that British opinion towards the cost of living crisis is significantly more negative than the overall global picture. Bank of England forecast suggests inflation is unlikely to return to its 2% target until the end of next year. That's 2024 or the start of 2025. Commenting, SNP economy spokesperson Stewart MP said, "The UK cost of living crisis has been years in the making as Tory cuts, Brexit, stagnant wages and soaring household costs hammer household incomes. It's no wonder people are gloomy about the prospects for change under Westminster control. People in Scotland are poorer as a direct result of the damaging decisions being imposed upon us by the Tories and pro-Brexit Labour Party, showing exactly why Scotland needs to become an independent country." Greg, things are really not looking up for ordinary people. And this idea that, feeling that your prospects are not great because the way in which your economy is being managed, the way in which the money coming through your door is going to be able to provide a decent standard of living, has massive impact upon our communities, on our people. And you're right, it's not just about the top, the top level here. We're talking about ordinary, decent human beings who are struggling because of the impact of a huge number of mistakes.
Yes. I've frozen again, by the way. Right, I thought you didn't move, and I thought I'd frozen in the screen. Short answer to that is yes, but I think you probably want a bit more than that. I do get concerned about the again discussions about the economy that and people's lack of confidence. It's understandable to have that. And I'm going to be part of repeating myself. The information that they get is telling people these should be your expectations. Okay, this is what you should judge as how you should judge if everything's going well for you. And those expectations are not honest. They're not realistic. They don't actually. It's not measured in terms of are people eating good food? Are they healthy? Do they have decent life expectancy? Do they have pleasure in their work? These are the measures which actually genuinely count. Instead, we're supposed to rejoice when GDP per capita exceeds a certain threshold. But my father told me a story about his father, who was briefly unemployed during the Great Depression. And he used to stand in the queue outside the Dole talking with his friends, and the conversation between them was just asking should they move their investments from gilts into shares, and how do they think the FTSE is going to stack up next week? And to the absolute amazement and horror of everybody around them, but they're just trying to kind of take the heat out of the real horror they were living. The point there is they realised that they were in the world 100 years ago. And we still haven't grown out of that fantasy world. We still haven't actually paid attention to what's important in it. So, we've discussed it a bit, but what I would like to do is people to look at other sources of information, which tells them maybe how other countries are doing, and other countries which take a different approach to what makes a good country and a healthy, happy economy, and maybe learn some lessons from it. A wee point, by the way, for the purposes of balance, which I'm sure you always seek in the programme, in talking about political parties, you talked about Brexit supporting Tories, and you talked about Brexit supporting Labour Party, and it was a gross omission on your part, Donald, to forget to mention the Brexit supporting Liberal Democrats, which kind of really narrows it down to who's against Brexit. I am.
Well, I stand corrected, and an interesting anecdote in terms of a century ago, heaven forfend that there would ever be a Prime Minister in the queue for some handing out some soup, suggesting to somebody who was unemployed and homeless that maybe they should have a career in finance. That would be just too appalling to consider. And I have actually got some breaking news that has just been handed to me, and that is that Boris Johnson has been referred to the police over fresh claims of COVID lockdown rule breaking. And the Cabinet Office has referred him to the police after his diary showed friends visiting Chequers, the Grace and Favour home, during the COVID pandemic. The trips to the Grace and Favour country residence were highlighted during preparations for a public inquiry into COVID, and the Cabinet Office has passed concerns to the Metropolitan Police and Thames Valley Police. The Privileges Committee, which is investigating claims that Mr Johnson misled Parliament over Partygate, has also been informed, according to the Times, which first reported on the story. The news has sparked calls for Mr Johnston to step down as an MP. Now, we haven't had time to look into this, but I can hardly think that you will be short of a viewpoint or two with regards to a former Prime Minister in the shape of a floppy-haired man who led the Brexit get us out of here charge. But this is, Boris Johnson is the Prime Minister who keeps on giving, or he is a head of a government that keeps on taking. And that is clearly just yet another astonishing revelation. One wonders where it will ever end.
There's several grades of level and authority to this discussion. You've got ordinary people who did occasionally daft things during lockdown and shouldn't have done, and we'll tut at them, and some of them got a fine for what they did, and that's at the kind of ordinary Joe type level. You've got the example of Margaret Ferrier, who did an extremely stupid thing, admittedly under very stressful conditions, but spent a few hours on a train travelling home rather than being trapped in London for several weeks. Absolutely wrong. Whether or not the penalty she's got, which means effectively being chucked out as an MP, is the right level, is maybe a debate, because you compared that with Mr Lockdown Breaker himself, who you've just mentioned, who had parties during COVID. When you were told, isolate, keep away from folk. No, he had parties. But it doesn't stop there, because there was the next level again, where the person who was the person in waiting to be head of state and is now the king brought his entourage up, and I don't think he took the golden carriage up. I think it was a few cars or whatever up to the big house in the Highlands, and he's because he had COVID and he wanted to get out in the country. He suspected he had COVID, and therefore jumped ship from the South of England to north of Scotland, and his staff caught COVID, some of them, and lots of people in nearby Ballater, lots of people got COVID. There was a sudden surge. And I wonder where the criminality in there is. Is it the ordinary Joe? Is it the one MP? Is it the Prime Minister holding parties? Is it the head of state whose minions infected a town? I think there's several levels, grades of guilt in there, and should be dealt with, and maybe in different ways.
Indeed, and talking of something that should be dealt with, and something you alluded to there as well, Greg, it is that 70% of Scots think Brexit is a failure. 70% of voters in Scotland think that Brexit has been a failure, according to a new YouGov poll. The fresh Brexit polling also found that a massive 80% of voters in Scotland think the Westminster government has handled Brexit badly. The survey conducted earlier this month revealed that only 6% of people in Scotland believe Brexit has been a success. The SNP has said the results demonstrate how out of touch the pro-Brexit Labour Party is with voters in Scotland, and, as my colleague has corrected, the pro-Brexit Liberal Democrats, as both continue to line up behind the Tories in promoting the virtues of a damaging Brexit that's hammered Scotland's economy. The Scottish National Party's Europe and EU accession spokesperson, Alan Smith MP, said, "These findings just go to show how out of touch Starmer's pro-Brexit Labour Party are with voters in Scotland. Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU, and voters are rightly horrified at the unmitigated disaster that has unfolded. Westminster has made a total mess of Brexit, dragging Scotland out of the world's largest single market that's 8 times the size of the UK against its will. That's the cost, he said, of Westminster democracy in action. I know, Greg, that Brexit is something that I think most of us have. I'm just astonished there's 30% that said either they had no opinion or that they thought it had been handled well. Is Brexit been handled badly? Is it a bad idea to begin with? Is there a bad attitude to fix it? Or is it just all of the above?
There's some things that you could describe as being handled badly, like arson or murder or fraud, or maybe say they can't be handled well or badly. They just shouldn't happen in the first place. So I'm not particularly interested in it as it been handled badly. Shouldn't have happened. There's other figures that you can put to that. The UK overall UK vote for Brexit was 52%. Everybody knows that. Hopefully everybody knows that Scotland, instead of voting 52% in favour of Brexit, voted 62% against it. Massively different result. Instead of a marginal let's get out, it was a thumping yes to staying in. And that, as you're quoting the figure in there, several polls over the last few months have shown it hovering around about 70% supporting Scotland for re-entering the EU. But the poll that you have in there showing 56% of the UK favouring re-entering, that's been hovering around the low 50s. In other words, another campaign, even remotely like the Brexit campaign in 2016, where people were conned into, vote to leave the EU and we'll give you all this money that we've written in this big bus, and you'll be rich and you'll be very well off, and prices, food will be cheaper, energy will be cheaper, all the things that people are told. Big money, big campaigns can buy people's thoughts on that. And if there was another Brexit campaign, England would vote overwhelmingly again to remain out of the EU. Scotland would, I believe, vote even more strongly to stay in the EU. But that's not the point. The point is it doesn't matter currently how Scotland thinks, how Scotland votes and what our wishes are. We're telt, we will stay telt unless we decide that we're going to tell ourselves and decide for ourselves that we want to change that and that we want to rejoin the EU, and they shouldn't stop us. As an independent country, we can, we will. And by the way, we shouldn't be coy about this at all. I know very, very, very few people who are trying to hedge bets on Brexit. They're either want outside the EU, that's a small minority, or they're thoroughly committed to being European citizens, as it still says in my passport, and I'm not sure I want to renew it at some stage to one that says that I'm not anymore.
Indeed, unfortunately, I'm just going about to have to, and it really does. It is something that I struggle with because of the idea of being part of something that I don't want to be part of. Well, I wouldn't go and join a supporters club of another club because they had better beer or they had better options. I would stay loyal to what I wanted and what I believed in, and I suppose in a sense that's one of the issues that the politicians in Westminster of a certain hue are crying about having to hold on to or break back into the heartlands, and suggesting that there is a type of individual that most of their policies are now directed at, where there does appear to be a number of polls and opinions out there that are suggesting that maybe people are a little more liberal minded than you're suggesting, that actually, even in those areas where they were abandoned by the Labour Party, both in terms of local government and in terms of their MPs and philosophy, that there's a possibility that there might now be people who are sitting ruining the very day that they put across against the fact that they wanted to leave the European Union. So is this something that politically they are reading the runes and getting it wrong in the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats? Because I've never known anything that so universally agreed it was a bad idea, yet there seem to be people falling over themselves to make it work better.
It would be daft to imagine that England was uniformly a right-wing Tory country and Scotland was uniformly a far-left socialist country. They're actually much more similar in many respects. Nonetheless, there is an easily identified and quite substantial difference between the two. England tends to veer towards the centre-right. Scotland tends to veer towards the centre-left. And I won't put it more strongly than that, but that's sufficient to bring about different attitudes. One thing I will say, by the way, I may condemn organisations which have campaigned for something which I find abhorrent, but I resist condemning the individuals who voted that way, because too many people have limited sources of information, maybe a limited amount of background to it. Not everybody studies politics on a daily basis the way you and I will do, Donald. So on the basis of that, it makes it easier for people to be susceptible to a good sell, a hard sell, a deluding set of statistics, a big notice painted on the side of a bus that makes them think that things will get better. And everybody wants things to get better, and if they're conned, and I don't mean that as a disparagement on the people, I'm talking that's disparagement against the conners. If people perpetrate a con trick and people unfortunately fall for it, then shame on the people who actually perpetrate that trick. There's hope, but a wee bit of more honesty in politics is quite good. The Labour Party wants to regain the seats in the red wall that it lost to the Tories, and to do so, it's got to put on some kind of Tory clothing. And if that's their choice, if that's what they want to do, that is democracy. They're entitled to do it, and people are entitled to vote for it or reject it. The strange one in Scotland is that I know plenty of people in the Labour Party who are pro-European and are finding it a bitter pill to swallow that they have to campaign against rejoining the EU when they absolutely fundamentally want to be a member of the EU. They might not want independence, but they want to be a member of the EU. Well, guess what, folks? It's no longer a case of independence means you're chucked out of the EU. If you want to be in the EU, you've got to be independent. And more and more people are realising that's where we're at. So if you want a progressive country, if you want to be in the EU, we now have three UK parties which don't agree with you, and you have one major one in Scotland which thoroughly agrees with you, and that's the way to go.
There we go, from the cost of political decision-making to prices, as UK food price inflation is at the third highest level it has been since 2008. That's since the financial crisis, with the annual rate at which the cost of groceries is increasing at the elevated level of 17.2%, retail industry data shows. Prices barely eased during the 4 weeks to the 14th of May to only marginally below April's 17.3% figure, according to the latest release from the analytics firm Kantar, representing the third highest rate of grocery inflation since 2008. The report came as the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, I told you we would return to him earlier in the programme, was scheduled to meet food manufacturers today to raise concerns over the impact of grocery price inflation on squeezed households. Even though the average cost of 4 pints of milk has come down by 8 pence since last month, it remains 30 pence higher than it was at this time last year at £1.60. Stubbornly high food and drink prices have added an extra whopping £833 a year to shoppers' bills, Kantar found, unless consumers make changes to their usual habits to try to cut the cost. More consumers are turning to supermarket own brand products, a trend also reported in April, in an attempt to keep their bills under control. Sales of the cheapest own-label products soared by 15.2% over the past month, almost double the 8.3% increase for branded products. Fraser McCarra, the head of retail and consumer insight at Kantar, said the drop in grocery price inflation, which is down by 0.1 percentage points on last month's figure, is without doubt welcome news for shoppers, but it is still incredibly high. Jeremy Hunt's meeting with representatives from the food manufacturing industry comes amid warnings that the rising cost of groceries will overtake the price of energy in the coming months as the driving force behind inflation, hitting poorer households the hardest. Grocery bills are predicted to increase further, while energy prices are expected to begin falling over the summer, according to analysis from the Resolution Foundation think tank. The consumer group, which called on the government to undertake its review of food pricing rules as quickly as possible to help shoppers when comparing products. And I suppose, Greg, when things are really bad, you expect a visit from Jeremy Hunt to cheer you up. Would you be front of the queue to attend that meeting?
I would thoroughly enjoy him coming to my door and having a conversation, and I would try to keep him there for 2 hours, locked in conversation, because that would stop him from talking to anybody else, and that would be a mission of mercy to keep him away from the rest of the population. No, he's not persuasive in this. You know, it's interesting, that actually what you were saying there about people going for the kind of cheaper own brand foods rather than the kind of the well-known brand foods. That ties in with some of the things we were talking about earlier on. Now, just because you've got a big letter K on a package doesn't mean that those particular type of cornflakes are absolutely the best in the world. Or if it's got a Z in it, doesn't mean that it's the best type of beans in the world. But nonetheless, people have been driven to get other things which taste different to them. They're different from what they're used to. And actually, sometimes if they get a cheap wee curry that costs £1.50 and you microwave it, maybe it's not got the best of meat in it. It could be the rice is the kind of leftovers. Maybe not, but commonly it can be that. A measure of how well people are doing, and this is where I come right back to what I was saying at the start, is not just necessarily about the cost of the food compared with their earnings and can they afford to buy what they want to, but the quality of the food which they're resorting to eat. And it's difficult to get metrics from that. You know, you can put a numerical value on monetary issues, on cost of items. Difficult to get a metric for quality of food. But if we were able to do that more easily, I think we'd probably find that people's quality of their diet, quality of what they consume, has dropped. And that's much more important because I take it back to my grandfather. It's easy to joke about the abstract concepts of economy and fiscal policy, whereas the reality is you're hungry and you're eating rubbish, and there's nothing you can do about it because you can't afford to do better. And let's pay a bit more attention to the literally the bread and butter issues of well-being of people. It's lost in the hogwash of abstracts when people, when economists try to bamboozle us with their statistics, which have little meaning to ordinary people.
Indeed, and of course, the great worry would be that the supermarkets are struggling. There's a possibility they're going to lose their profits. They're probably in deficit just now. Oh no, wait a minute. They are making not quite as much as they did, but they seem to be surviving, and the dividends seem to be slightly down than it was before, but certainly available for those to pick them up. Whereas in the own brand products, what I'm reading is that these are increasing in price in percentage terms faster than the well-known brands, so that people who are looking to save a bit of cash are finding that they're not saving as much as they could have done 6, 7, 9 months ago. It seems to be that the only people winning out of this cost of living crisis appear to be those who are selling, not buying.
Indeed. And by the way, you didn't spread your cast a net of sympathy far enough either there, Donald. You forgot about the poor oil companies who down to their last few £1 billion of annual profit. And sympathy for them. They'd hoped to have been making much more out of this crisis than they have done, but they're doing okay. We're not, but they are. It's we are where we are, and we're not where we should be, and there are ways of getting there, and we have to make choices on should we embark on that journey. Indeed.
And from sympathy for those who may be making a little bit of cash out of where we are, we move to Suella Braverman, who has announced today new limits on overseas students bringing their family to the UK. While Downing Street was rejecting suggestions that Rishi Sunak is dithering over whether to launch a formal inquiry into her conduct, the Home Secretary has rushed out fresh curbs on international students who come to study in the UK amid growing pressure on the Home Secretary over her conduct whilst in office. Under proposals released in Parliament today, overseas students will no longer be able to bring family with them except under specific circumstances, as the government seeks to reduce immigration numbers. Only overseas students on courses designated as research programmes will be able to bring dependents with them under new rules to curb net migration. The policy was released in a written ministerial statement as the government answered an urgent question on whether Braverman told officials to organise a private speed awareness course in breach of the ministerial code. Under the proposals, the government will remove the ability for international students to switch out of the student route and into work routes before their studies have been completed. As well as removing this right, there will also be a review of the maintenance requirement for students and dependents. The changes will come into effect for students starting their courses from January 2024 in order to allow future international students time to plan ahead. Official statistics due to be published later this week are expected to show that net migration increased from 504,000 in the 12 months to June 2022 to more than 700,000 in the year to December. Greg, I hardly know where to begin because, first of all, conduct of Suella Braverman is certainly going to be the headline. But casting something that, in a bad news or a good news day, sending something out under the radar, this has massive implications, not just in terms of us as a country, but also universities up and down the country are struggling to attract foreign and international students. This is yet another example of the British government attempting to stop those of a different hue and a different cry from coming into this country who could have a net positive effect, not only as an economy, but also in our international standing.
Yes, it's absolutely massive, and it's not just a short term, but very long term damaging. It's fascinating. This comes from Suella Braverman. She, by the way, so many people make the jokes about Cruella Braverman and so on, and hint that it's Cruella de Vil. Well, it's not a very funny one, but her actual name is not Suella, it's Sue Ellen, that's what's on her birth certificate. But she wishes to use a fancier, much more upper middle class sounding name, and that's because she's wanting to distance herself from family past. She is descended from immigrants. Am I making a racist statement here? Hell no. I am descended from immigrants. All four of my grandparents were immigrants to this country from Ireland, and they made their contribution. Their children, my parents, made their contribution. I've been making my contribution. And anything which tries to demonise immigrants coming into a country who are then going to work hard and better that country as well as themselves is just crazy. Because of the kind of things that we were talking about earlier on of brainwashing people into thinking that certain things are bad and other things are good, whether or not in absolute terms it's true, just brainwashing folk into it. Immigration is certainly not the horrible thing that so many people, sadly, in England in particular, I think is the case. They might want to see a reduction in immigration in England. We need it in Scotland. We absolutely need to see a population growth. At the time of the Union of Parliaments, Scotland's population was much smaller than England, but it wasn't a 12th of the population of England. Nothing remotely as sizable a gap as that. Can I give a wee bit of background? I'm a former academic. I retired as a lecturer just short of 10 years ago. 20 years ago, I was doing recruitment in India and spent a couple of weeks each year out there talking to students, bringing them over. They weren't all going to do research degrees. They were largely going to do honours degrees or master's degrees. And when I was out there the first time, about 19 years ago, there was a debate going on in the Scottish Parliament. Should we have a scheme which would be a new blood initiative. It would allow people to come into the country, study here, and then work on for a couple of years afterwards. And it took a lot of debate, and eventually we got a concession that was allowed. Scotland uniquely would be able to do that. And we ended up with students scraping together money with difficulty to pay fees coming to a Scottish university, but they came, and afterwards they got great jobs, and many of them settled down and either brought out their spouse or settled here and married here and had families and so on, and contributed to the growth, and are still doing so. It's wonderful. Then it was reversed by Westminster, said, oh, this is bad, this affects immigration. Immigration is something which is decided in London, therefore Scotland is going to have the right to do this, removed from it. So we actually had a progressive policy in place for several years that worked in Scotland's interest, absolutely, and then that was reversed for, well, I'm going to say that right at the bottom of most of that, the reasons in there is just the innate racism. We don't want foreigners in the country. Everybody's a foreigner. If you go to another country, you're the foreigner. So it shouldn't be used as a pejorative term. We should actually welcome it. And what we're seeing just now, being imposed in Scotland for England's needs, to meet England's needs, is really going to be damaging. The future technocrats, the future engineers, the future medics of Scotland have been locked out at the borders. And applying that to students, that's cutting it off at the initial part. It's just at the point where these people could be of great benefit to us if they stayed.
Indeed, and of course we go from one decision that may affect our global status to what has been described by many as quite an astonishing move, as the SNP have condemned the UK government attempts to undermine Scotland's global status. In a Scottish Government debate at Holyrood today, the SNP sharply criticised the Tories over the UK government's attempts to block Scotland's international trade and cultural links. In a letter to UK diplomats earlier this year, Foreign Secretary James Cleverly required ambassadors to gather information on news of Scottish ministers' foreign visits, and that all Scottish Government communication with foreign countries must be facilitated through the UK Government. The Foreign Secretary also asked all ambassadors to instruct foreign countries to go through the UK and not talk directly to Scottish representatives, and that a UK official must sit in on meetings with Holyrood officials and foreign counterparts. The response from the Scottish National Party came in a Scottish Government debate in Holyrood this afternoon on the Scottish Connections Framework, which outlines Scottish Government commitments and ambitions to strengthen and expand our relationships with and between Scotland's international communities, and expand on existing work with our established networks. The Foreign Secretary's actions has received criticism across the political spectrum, with former Labour First Minister Henry McLeish saying that he saw the letter by James Cleverly as part of a wider assault on devolution. Commenting, SNP MSP Emma Harper said, the Tories don't want Scotland's international presence to grow, and have proved they will do whatever it takes to throw water on our fire. Prohibiting the Scottish Government from being able to participate in its vital work abroad will have far-reaching implications for Scottish trade, international relationships and cultural exchanges. Once again, Suella Breverman threw me, Boris Johnson throws you, James Cleverly just throws the whole thing out of the pram. How in the name of heavens is that in anybody's sense a reasonable thing to do, given that all civil servants have a duty and responsibility to the government, not to the political party? And there are well-established international links across Scotland's past and history. It seems like Big Brother doesn't like when Wee Brother does things that's better than Big Brother.
Can I hop back to the comments earlier on about Sue Ellen changing her name to Suella? That was an unnecessary and counterproductive change. One change of name that really could and should have been made just to kind of help with relevance would be James Cleverly changing his surname to something more apt, more appropriate to his demeanour and actions. Hasn't done it yet, don't expect him to, and he is a bit of a standing joke. And I mean that actually, when he had his edict that Scottish government ministers would not be allowed, would be banned from talking to foreign diplomats. Or they would have a spy in the camp someday from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office sitting in and vetting and reporting back on the discussions. That was so laughable. So actually what we saw within a week was lots and lots of events taking place where Scottish ministers were travelling around Europe and getting photographs taken with ambassadors and other diplomats and heads of foreign deputations and the like. So Europe is looking at this and thinking this is crazy. So it may be that Westminster feels that it can dictate how part of the UK can behave, but maybe Westminster hasn't realised that it's no longer a part of the EU, therefore it has no say in how the rest of the EU itself behaves. So that's going to run into the sand. There's a wee bit, there's something going on in here though, that a wee historical part to it. In the run-up to the Act of Union 1707, I think I referred to it earlier on, in the run-up to that, there were everybody that's read the history of the period up to that knows about the Darien scheme and how it collapsed, and Scotland was bankrupted, and because we were a bankrupt country, we had to join with England to form the UK. And a lot of that story is utter nonsense. Scotland wasn't bankrupted. The aristocrats who ran the scheme took a gamble, and as gamblers often do, they lost. They were compensated for their losses. They were given money to vote in favour of Scotland joining up with England. And the people of Scotland lost, but the aristocrats, they survived. But another thing in there was, if I remember correctly, it was the Alien Act. It was the where Scotland was banned from exporting from its own ports and had to send its goods from English ports. And basically, they had the imposition of market rules on Scotland, which suited England and were to the detriment of Scotland. But you know what? You're caught. We've got you. We have you under control, and you'll do what we want. And it still continues. There should be no automatic presumption that any act to do with trade or trading arrangements between Scotland and England are for the benefit of all in the UK, and certainly not for those in Scotland. It's the larger of the partners is basically what it's about. Okay. So, long story. We could discuss that another day.
And indeed, and it is, we go from the whole issue of people telling stories in order to get somewhere to another fairly famous individual who has been telling stories, and E. Jean Carroll has filed. So we move from there on to links with Spanish businesses, which is all about strengthening Scotland's links. And we have been talking about Europe, and Trade and Innovation Minister Richard Lochhead is going to be meeting business leaders during a visit to Spain from 23rd to 25th of May, aimed at unlocking new trade and investment opportunities. Spain is a priority market in the Scottish Government's Growth Export Plan, a trading nation, worth £623 million in goods exports in 2022. Figures from last year show that Spanish businesses in Scotland employ 10,630 people and turn over £4.59 billion annually. The Minister's two-day visit includes meeting with energy and renewables firms, a digital health company, a leading hotel chain planning to open its first Scottish hotel in 2025, and one of Spain's top spirits exporters, which is looking at investing in a Scottish distillery. It will come to a close with a meeting at Iberdrola, the Spanish company which owns Scottish Power, to discuss how its green hydrogen projects align with Scotland's net zero ambitions. Spain is estimated to be the fourth largest country in the European Union, with a population of 47 million, and is one of the fastest growing economies in the Eurozone. Mr. Lochhead was reported as saying, despite ongoing global economic headwinds and the impacts of Brexit and COVID, Scotland continues to perform well in attracting foreign direct investment. My focus will be in building relationships with new and existing investors, supporting export opportunities, and raising Scotland's profile internationally. It will also be a chance to highlight the benefits of our new green free ports to Spanish firms looking for a base in Scotland. It will be highlighting the Scottish Government's commitments to work with investors to develop projects that will enable large-scale hydrogen production with export routes to Europe. Across Europe, the opportunities that exist out there, Spain being one of them, and this is clearly something in terms of the amount of business that it means for Scotland, is a priority for the Scottish Government, but there must be more in terms of how we would be able to, and I would imagine Europe will be looking at James Cleverly and giving him a different surname when they realise that there's going to be a babysitter sent along with people with whom they have done business for such a long time.
And it's interesting that this is with Spain, because again, as most of your viewers will be aware, that Spain's relationship with Scotland politically is a bit different from other countries, because the situation in Spain with Catalonia seeking to become independent and Spain throwing everything that it can at it constitutionally to block it, to stop it from happening, means that Spain is very twitchy about any other part of any other country in Western Europe doing the same. What they have said, by the way, is that if Scotland decides through a legitimate process to be independent, then they won't block Scotland becoming a part of the EU. That's misreported as saying that they will block it. It's not. I've just reported what they do say. But the fact that the nonetheless companies there have no inhibition at all in talking trade with Scotland and Scottish government ministers is extremely encouraging indeed, because they've been quite pragmatic, quite sensible about this. There's a term that we only heard after 2016, the UK single market. Up to that point, single market always meant the EU single market. We had the Customs Union single market, absolutely part of something that we were used to, and we wanted to retain in Scotland, and we voted to retain. This concept of UK single market, the term you never heard it at all, but it's now been used as a device to say that anything which deviates from the UK single market and turns it into effectively an English market and a Scottish market is unacceptable. Therefore, Scotland must conform with the UK market, meaning it must conform with what Westminster decides, meaning that Scotland must conform with England and all such things. And that is us being severely constrained, and we have to, if there was, the UK government has been very foolish in this. If they were actually to give a bit more ground, not block activities in Scotland, but actually encourage them, as did happen 10 years ago, encourage divergence on certain policies, then possibly people in Scotland would be more content with what we have constitutionally. You mentioned there, by the way, hydrogen production. That's part of the future of Scotland. Scotland is the Saudi Arabia of renewables. Scotland has incredible energy sources. And I'm not just talking about oil. Who cares about oil? Who needs it? Norway doesn't use the oil income. It banks it for the future. Scotland doesn't need it. It's a bonus, not a foundation. And with our renewable energy, we can produce hydrogen, storable hydrogen, and that is an energy source, a mobile, for planes, cars, ships, everything. That is absolutely the future. And we're in the best possible place to be in Scotland to build a future on that. And the fact that people want to talk to us about that tells you where the actual wealth lies. We talked about the well-being of individuals. We talked about the well-being of countries. Well, actually, the well-being of Scotland as a country, and if you want to measure its wealth, it shouldn't be in GDP per capita. It should be in the amount of water, agriculture, energy production that we have. That's the actual natural wealth of Scotland, and it is all renewable, and it's going to buy us a very good future.
Indeed, and finally tonight we go from the well-being of us as a nation through the economy to the National Care Service, as it's been announced that the Scottish Government are looking to ask people what they think about how a new National Care Service should work. Programme of meetings taking place over the summer, stretching from Dumfries and Galloway to Shetland. Will also be online meetings for anyone who would prefer to join discussions remotely. And during a visit to the allied health professionals in Bonnyrigg, which includes the 14 health professions that make up the third largest workforce in the NHS Scotland, Social Care Minister Marie Todd spoke with staff about what they want to see from the co-design of the new national approach. Details for all events, and you can see on the screen where to get them, are available on the online booking page, which is there. First event is going to take place in Stirling the 20th of June, and there are opportunities in Glasgow, Dundee, Dumfries and Galloway, Oban, Skye, Strathpeffer, Shetland, Elgin, and that includes in Skye a Gaelic name which is almost more difficult than the Ukrainian from earlier on. And in Elgin there are a couple of national online events on the 24th and 29th of August, but this stretches from Stirling on the 20th of June through to the 22nd of August in Elgin, and plenty of opportunity for people to have their say. And so, with that being our final news item, Greg, it leaves me to thank you this evening and look forward to another opportunity to pick up on some of the things that we just started to scratch the surface on. But thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Very enjoyable. Thank you very much, Donald. Like that.
So here we are at the end of yet another evening in terms of Broadcasting Scotland, Scotland at 7. But before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So on behalf of everybody here at Broadcasting Scotland who are in our studio, but also joining us from elsewhere, to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We've made a commitment that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. With a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers, it would enable us to employ staff to make more programmes, and some of the things that we had the opportunity to discuss tonight could be something that was in slightly more detail, an opportunity to delve into things that don't hit the headlines, but were important to people living and breathing and working in Scotland today. So, from here at the Broadcasting Scotland Studio, from me, Donald C. Stewart, from everybody in the studio, and indeed from my guest, Greg, thank you and good night, and thank you for watching.